Okay, so I want to welcome everybody tonight as we continue our study on the book of Genesis. And tonight we're going to be in chapter number 29. We're going to look at 30 verses because the last part of this chapter fits nicely with chapter 30. And so we're going to pick up where we left off last week in 28, where Jacob has left his father's house and he is headed towards Haran, which is up here. And along the way, he stopped at this location here, which is north of Jerusalem, and had an encounter with God, which led him to the naming or the calling of this place as Beit El, or House of God. And so tonight we're going to pick up from him leaving off from that location, that encounter with God, and arriving at his destination, which is near Haran, where his mother's family is. And we're going to look at the story of Jacob coming to Laban's house, meeting Rachel, and ending up being married to two women by the end of our study. But as always, before we jump into the actual reading of the text, why don't we go ahead and pray for the Lord to open our minds and our hearts, and then we'll jump in. Father, we thank you for your goodness. Lord, I thank you for this group of people that have come out on a Tuesday night to learn about your word. I pray that our time this evening will be fruitful, that you would help us to gain insight into your word, into the stories that you've given us to learn from. And Lord, I pray that you help us to learn about your character and about things that we can take and apply in our everyday life. And we will give you the praise for that in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Let's jump into 29 and verse 1. It says, "Then Jacob went on his journey." And you've probably noticed by now as we've read along, but see where this little cross-looking mark is? When you see that, that means that there's something in the actual Hebrew that reads differently than how it's worded. But literally, it says when Jacob lifted his legs or lifted his feet, and he went, he came or went into the land of the people of the east. Notice that people of the east has the little mark as well, which literally says the sons of the east. And what's interesting about that phrase is it's all obviously picking up from the story or the scene that we've seen in chapter 28, where Jacob has this encounter with God. He's on the run. Esau wants to kill him. God shows up. He has this encounter with God, this dream, the ladder, and him being in the presence of God, and God affirming the covenantal promise that has been on Abraham and Isaac, now being on Jacob as well. And it says that he came into the land of the sons of the east. Now, what's interesting about the direction of east is that a lot of times in the Bible, an eastward direction is a direction of judgment, or it is a direction of vanity, and it doesn't work favorably. For example, when Adam and Eve fell in the garden, which direction were they sent? Eastward. When Cain killed Abel, he was sent eastward, right? When Abraham decided he was going to give everything to Isaac, he sent his other sons where? Eastward. So eastward is usually not a positive thing, although we know that he has been sent by his parents to marry specific individuals from his mother's family. But going eastward usually is not cast in a positive light. And we're going to see that as the story develops in this chapter, and especially after this chapter, we're going to see that even though his journey seems to begin prosperous and everything just falls into place like you would envision it to, things come unraveled rather quickly. And those few days that Rebekah said he should go and spend at her family getting a wife develop into much more than just a few days. So we'll see that as we read along. But basically, there are 3 scenes in verses 1 through 14 alone. The first scene being Jacob meeting some shepherds, then meeting Rachel, and then ultimately meeting Laban. And then between verse 14 and 15, you have kind of a scene change and a lapse of time, and we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But let's go back to our text. Verse 2, and he looked, and behold, a well in the field. It's interesting that he would come to a well, as we'll see as we continue to read, because Isaac and Rebekah's marriage was arranged from where? A well. A meeting of Abraham's servant goes to this same area and actually meets Jacob's mother at this well, and the marriage is arranged, and she agrees to come back and eventually marry Isaac. Now here we have Jacob himself, not someone sent on his behalf, but Jacob himself comes and sees a well in the field. And lo, there were 3 flocks of sheep lying by it. For out of that well they watered the flocks, and a great stone was upon the well's mouth. Now, what's interesting about verse 2 is it says that you have flocks of sheep. I'm going to click on it, and it's this particular Hebrew word, adair, which means flock or herd, but it's a different word that has been used so far in Genesis. This is the first occurrence of this particular word for flock in Genesis, which has led some scholars to say it is evidence of some other author writing this particular passage. I don't believe that's necessarily the case, because you can have scribal editing later on and they may change particular words to an updated version of the audience reading the text at that time. But I thought I would point that out because it is in the text. Another thing that I want to point out there in verse 2, it says there was a great stone that was upon the well's mouth. This stone that would be covering this well would be a large stone that would take usually a couple strong individuals, men, to move. And we're going to see that comes into play later on in the story when Jacob goes to move it himself. But verse 3 says, and there were all the flocks gathered. Now, there's a text critical note here that I want to show you right here. I'm going to highlight it. And notice over here in the Hebrew, this is a Hebrew text that has a text critical apparatus, which if you've been here on Wednesday nights, you know what that is. It tells you that there are textual variants. And in this particular verse, that word here over here in verse 3, it says, and there were all the flocks gathered. Right here, we have a text critical note that says, and there all the shepherds gathered. Okay? So which one would be accurate? What's actually here in the text? Hadarim, which is flocks, or shepherds? When we continue reading, watch what it says. Take away this colon because that's clearly added in the English, but it doesn't exist in the Hebrew. But it says, and there were all the flocks or shepherds gathered, and they rolled the stone from the well's mouth. Which do you think would be the more appropriate translation? And there were all the shepherds gathered, and they rolled the stone from the well's mouth. Or and there were all the flocks gathered, and they rolled the stone from the well's mouth. Which one? Shepherds. It should be shepherds. So here's a perfect example of what I've said many times, that there is no text that doesn't have alternative variants, which shows the clear reality here in chapter 29 that you have a textual variant which fits better than what you see in the Masoretic text, which means that when we make the statement that the Word of God is inerrant, we must not be speaking of the actual written text itself. Otherwise, we run into a lot of problems that we can't explain away, and the evidence will contradict. So we stand by the fact that the word spoken was inerrant, but the preservation of that word is not, because we're dealing with human beings which are flawed. Okay? So, and there were all the shepherds gathered, and they rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the sheep and put the stone again upon the well's mouth in its place. Now, verse 3 is just like the narrator just adding the purpose of what the well was for and what they done with the rock that was setting on the well. This is not actually happening at this moment. They are not watering the flock, as we'll see as we continue reading. It's simply the narrator explaining to the audience the logistics of what is seen or stated prior to this point. But verse 4 says, "And Jacob said unto them, My brethren, whence be you, or where are you from? And they said, Of Haran are we." How convenient, right? Because that's where he is coming to. And he said unto them, Do you know Laban, the son of Nahor? And they said, We know him. And he said unto them, Is he well? And they said, He is well. And behold, Rachel his daughter comes with the sheep. So his journey is proving to be quite fruitful thus far. On the way to this location, he has a divine encounter with the God he has heard about from his father and his grandfather, right? I'm not sure how you could top that off, but he actually gets to the location of where he is sent to find a bride, and he gets there looking for a particular person, and he runs into shepherds who happen to know that particular individual, Laban. And while he's talking to the shepherds, along comes one of that particular man's daughters, whom he was told by his mother to go and marry. How convenient. I mean, when you jump into this story, it's like, man, Jacob has everything going right for him. I mean, everything's fallen into place. Everything's easy. He's had an encounter with God. And here comes Rachel, his daughter, Laban's daughter, coming with the sheep, which tells us she is what? A shepherdess. Which is interesting because thus far in Genesis, we've seen that shepherds play a quite prominent role throughout the book of Genesis. And actually, in the existence of Israel, we'll see that God calls and uses a lot of shepherds, right? We've seen that with Isaac, with Abraham. We see that with Moses when he's called. David is a shepherd. I mean, you have this theme that's running through the Bible of God choosing shepherds or shepherdess for involvement in his plan being brought to pass. So she's coming with the sheep. Now, as she's coming, he said, Lo, it is yet high day. Notice that we have the little cross-looking emblem, and it literally translated, and he said, the day is great. In other words, it's getting later in the day. Neither is the time come that the cattle should be gathered together. Water the sheep and go and feed them. Like, So Jacob shows up on the scene, and he's like barking orders. He's like, it's the middle of the day, and you need to water the sheep and go and let them graze, let them pasture. Which, to his credit, he is qualified to make this assertion because he is, after all, a shepherd, right? The text has told us prior to this that he is a shepherd. He dwelt in tents, which means that he was like a nomad moving with his herd and kept flocks. So he's giving these strangers advice. I wonder why he would want to do that, given that they have just said, here comes Laban's daughter. Right? You guys need to go feed your sheep. What are you hanging out by the well? And watch their response, verse 8. And they said, we cannot until all the flocks be gathered together. Notice this word here, flocks. Let me highlight it. Notice over here in the Hebrew again, we have this little marker here. And it says the textual variant, which is the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint, both have Haroim, which is shepherds. Okay, so you have two other sources, the Samaritan writing and the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew text. Both say shepherds. So which do you think would be more plausible? And they said, we cannot water the sheep until all the flocks be gathered or all the shepherds be gathered. It should be shepherds, because the shepherds coming and everybody at once removing the stone from the well and watering the flocks. It says, and till they roll the stone from the well's mouth. So do you think shepherds roll the stone from the well's mouth or flocks? Shepherds, which is why shepherds is the smoother reading in this situation. Then we water the sheep. Obviously, you can't water the sheep with the big rock on the covering of the well. Verse 9. And while he yet spake with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she kept them. Now, who would her father be? Laban, which is who? Brother of Rebekah. So this would be what in relation to Jacob?
His uncle and father-in-law.
Uncle and like triple cousin. Because remember, Abraham is also in the genealogy of this side of the family as well. So you have a lot of kinship here. But she's coming with her father's sheep because she kept them. Again, she was a shepherdess. Verse 10, and it came to pass when Jacob saw Rachel, or Rachel in Hebrew, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother. You reckon they're trying to point something out here? And it came to pass when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother. Like you told us that once, right? That's just the repetitive nature of Hebrew narrative that is geared towards being spoken and not read. Remember, in antiquity, very few human beings had access to actual writing. Matter of fact, few human beings could actually read. Most things were dictated through speaking orally. So you have a lot of repetitiveness, and that's part of what we're seeing here. So it says, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, that Jacob went near. Watch this, He-Man here, trying to show off. Jacob went near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. right? Normally, the shepherds wait till all the shepherds get there and they corporately move the stone, water the flocks, go about their way after they cover the... Oh, you think he's trying to impress her? I mean, we're taking a little liberty to read into the text what it doesn't say, but clearly he is trying to take the bull by the horns and, earn some brownie points, if nothing else, by moving the stone himself and watering the flock. Okay? So, here he is with one of the daughters that his mother has pointedly said that he needs to attempt to marry, and everything's working out flawlessly. Verse 11, and Jacob kissed Rachel and lifted up his voice and wept. Now, it doesn't say what all has been said, because if he would have just kissed her, if she's a stranger and then just start weeping, she'd probably be like, what's wrong with this dude? So you have to assume that some sort of dialogue would have taken place. Otherwise, it would be quite awkward, you would expect. Verse 12. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's brother and that he was Rebekah's son. And she ran and told her father. Now, what's interesting about this is Laban was involved in the story where Rebekah's marriage was arranged. You remember the story? When Abraham's servant came to a well and then comes in contact with Laban, and Laban acted on behalf of the father, Bethuel, which we presume is, was deceased, and therefore Laban was acting as the head of the family, and the marriage was arranged. Now, he's going to be involved in marriage again, but in a different situation for sure, because he's coming himself and it's not being arranged. So, verse 13 says, it came to pass when Laban heard the tidings of Jacob, his sister's son. Notice we have the mark here, the hearing of Jacob, his sister's son, that he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his house. Now, remember when Abraham sent his servant? What did he send with his servant? Treasures, dowry gifts. So, you have to think, I wonder if Laban hears that Abraham's grandson has come. You have to wonder if he's thinking, aha, I got rich the last time they came, and I'm going to go out and meet them, because it says that he ran to meet him, embraced him, and kissed him, and brought him to his house. And he told Laban all these things. Now, it doesn't tell us what all Jacob told Laban, so we don't know. We just have that statement. He told Laban all these things. But verse 14 says, Laban said to him, surely you are my bone and my flesh. And he abode with him the space of a month. Now, in contrast to when Abraham's servant came and brought all the treasures and gifts, Jacob is coming with nothing. Remember, Jacob is fleeing. Jacob isn't bringing livestock. He isn't bringing gifts. The only thing he is bringing is himself. Now, what is amazing about this story that the text really doesn't give us any details about is that Jacob is not some teenage boy. Remember, Esau was 40 when he got married, and this scene here is taking place several years, even decades after that story. Now, if you do some reading ahead and then you do some tracking backwards and doing basically simple math, you can see that it's presumed that Jacob, when he leaves home, is around the age of 77. So again, we have another instance of delayed or procrastinated arrangement of marriage, just like we had with Isaac. Isaac was 40, which was uncommon, because in the ancient Near East, the normal natural thing is when you hit puberty, it's time to start working and supporting yourself and having a family and making babies. That's just how their culture was. So the fact that he is this old is kind of amazing to this storyline. Now, actually, let me see if I can find it. I actually have a document here that kind of gives us a chronology of the life of Jacob. And I'm going to let you look at it just to kind of give you an idea, but this is the year, and then it has events highlighted throughout Jacob's life. But this is the presumed age of Jacob when he goes to Haran. Now, we're going to see in the story that he works 7 years and he marries Leah, and he also marries Rachel as well. But it's very, matter of fact, I cut that off there. There we go. And then you have the chronology of his sons being born. Now again, nothing in the text thus far has given us enough information that we could detect or put this list together. But when we read ahead and we get closer to the story of Joseph, we can read backwards and do some subtracting and get an idea. Now, this is not definite for sure. We can get a definite date on basically the timing of the birth of Joseph and things like that, but this is a list that is anyone interested in having this, I can print it off for everybody and bring it next week if you'd be interested in it. Okay, I'll do that, and that'll help you as we go along through the rest of the book. But I said all that to say this: he is, for sure probably in his 70s, and so he's, no wonder he's shooing off the shepherds and wanting to get this deal going, right? He's like, I'm 77. I'm 70-year-old virgin. It's time to get this show on the road, because after all, the promise is about what? Descendants. Right? And, when you're 77, you're really not, making a whole lot of babies, unless you're from Abraham's family. Right? And it's a divine happening of the Lord. So, anyone 77 want to have a baby? Right? No, you don't want to have a baby. You want to hold a baby for 5 minutes and then pass them along, right? So Laban said to him, surely you are my bone and my flesh. And he abode with him the space of a month, or a month of days, literally in Hebrew is what it says. Now, so you have a month that he stays in, and presumably that would be at the most how long he would have stayed there. He would have got his bride, and he would have went back to the land of Canaan. Remember, because Rebecca said, just go for a few days till his anger be turned away. Maybe he'll forget about it after your father's death. They're presuming he's going to die soon. All of that doesn't happen, but here he is. A month has passed, so we have a transition here in between verse 14 and 15. And Laban said unto Jacob, because you are my brother, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall your wages be? So he's been working and helping with Laban. Of course, if you're wanting to marry one of his daughters, what are you going to do? You're going to volunteer yourself to help in any way that you can to earn favor with Laban so that you can marry the daughter that you desire. So he's worked for a month helping him, and Laban says, hey, you're my brother, you're my flesh and blood, you shouldn't serve me for nothing. What shall your wages be? And verse 16, and Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel, Rachel. That's inserted, obviously, by the narrator to kind of set the stage. And it goes, because notice how it goes from, what you shouldn't serve me for nothing, what shall your wages be? And then the narrator jumps in and says, oh, by the way, Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. And verse 17 tells us even more about them. It says, Leah was tender-eyed, which would be a polite way of saying she was a little homely. She wasn't going to win the beauty pageant. And Rachel was beautiful and well-favored. Literally in the Hebrew, was of beautiful form and appearance. So Rachel was the more attractive of the 2. So with that in mind, verse 18, and Jacob loved Rachel. Love at first sight. Thus the He-Man, rendition of him jerking the stone off and watering the flock. So because he loved Rachel, he said, I will serve you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. Now, why would he offer 7 years of labor to have Rachel? Because in the ancient Near East, marriages were arranged with dowry gifts. He don't have any, which is kind of a slap in the face to Isaac and Rebekah for sending him off in haste without any dowry gifts. But he has nothing to offer. So what does he do? He offers 7 years' wages, because in that day, in that culture, 1 month of labor would be between half a shekel and 1 shekel's worth of wage. And it was not uncommon for a dowry gift to be 50 shekels. Do the math. And he's offering him a higher price for the culture of that day as a dowry to be able to marry the woman of his dreams, Rachel. And Laban said, verse 19, it is better that I give her to you than that I should give her to another man. Abide with me, or stay with me. So Laban agrees to that agreement. He'll work 7 years. After 7 years, he can marry Rachel. Poor guy, 77. Got to wait 7 more years. Stare at her every day. I mean, it shows you that he really wanted Rachel and was willing to work for 7 years. So verse 20, and Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed unto him but a few days for the love he had to her. Yeah, right. That's back in the day where labor was tough, right? But it's clearly trying to indicate his passion and his love, his desire to have her as a wife. And so he served the 7 years, and to him, it was worth it. Seemed but a few days because of such love that he had for her. How many guys would have worked 7 years to have your wife? Nobody said anything, so we'll just keep going. All the guys were like, I didn't hear anything. Verse 21. And Jacob said unto Laban, give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled, that I may go in unto her. I wonder what he had on his mind. 84-year-old Jacob's like, it's time to get this show on the road. Right? He's like, give her to me. And that phrase in Hebrew is not a polite phrase. It's demanding. Like, give her to me. My days are fulfilled. In other words, I've worked 7 years. I've earned this. Give her to me because I want to have sex with her. That's literally what it says in verse 21, that I may go in unto her. That is talking about consummating the marriage, through sexual union. So he's demanding, which the way he says it, and if you could see it in Hebrew, it's more clear, but the way he says it speaks of tension that has built over these 7 years, because he is making a demand for her, and that is indicated in the way that he makes that statement. Now, verse 22. And Laban gathered together all the men of the place and made a feast. So he's going to presumably carry out his part of the deal in giving Rachel to be married. Or at least that's how it will appear. Verse 23. And it came to pass in the evening that he took Leah, his daughter, and brought her to him. And he went in unto her. Now, what would provide the opportunity for Leah to be brought and for him to have a sexual relationship with her and not realize it? One explanation. He was drunk. They would have had a feast, and part of the ancient Near East custom at feast is they had wine. As you see in Jesus' day, Jesus turned the water into wine when they ran out. 84-year-old Jacob, he is like, booyah, the day has come, finally. And he has a bit too much to drink, and Laban probably seen to it that he did. He probably brought out the best of the best, and Jacob just went along with the flow because he wanted to get what he wanted to get, and he get himself in trouble because Laban brings the wrong daughter, the ugly duckling, and he has sex with her, and he doesn't realize it. Now, verse 24, it inserts this reality, and Laban gave unto his daughter Leah Zilpah, his maid, for a handmaid. Why would he give her Zilpah as a handmaid? Wedding gift. Would have been a great wedding gift. Someone who would serve her as she bare children around the house, keeping the house, whatever she wanted her to do. So he gave her a gift. Now it came to pass, verse 25, the reality. It came to pass that in the morning, behold, it was Leah. Yeah, sobriety has taken over. He wakes up. He rolls over and says, oh no. Right? And after working 7 years to get Rachel and waking up next to Leah, you're ticked off. I'll assure you of that.
Where'd that beautiful face go?
Yeah. Notice his response, verse 25. And he said to Laban, what is this that you have done unto me? Did not I serve with you for Rachel? Wherefore then has you beguiled me? Looks like the trickster has been tricked. Looks like what goes around comes around. Looks like you reap what you sow. And he has gotten a little dose of his own medicine. He has been manipulated instead of being the manipulator. And even though he is the elect, he is the chosen line, and he has a promise on his life, it shows that he is not above being rebuked and reproved and punished for what he has done himself to others. So he has been deceived, which is fitting. Doesn't make it right, but he is getting a little dose of his own medicine. And watch the reply of Laban, verse 26. And Laban said, "It must not be so done in our country." Our country there should actually read in our place. "To give the younger before the firstborn," which is two words that were in the beginning of the introducing of Jacob and Esau. You have the firstborn, and then you have the younger. So he is saying, in contrast to what has been prophesied over Jacob, in that the elder would serve the younger, he says, in our place, it's not done that way, to give the younger before the firstborn. But he goes on and says this, he tries to make a deal, because I can assure you, Jacob is really ticked off. He says, "Fulfill her week," which was the ancient Near East custom of consummating the marriage through feasting and celebration for a week. So the feast that started, the day that he, got deceived, would have carried on for a week. That was just the custom of the day. They feasted and celebrated and kind of partied for a week. And so he says, "Fulfill her week, and we will give you also for the service which you shall serve me yet another 7 years." So basically he says, I tell you what, you go ahead and celebrate with Leah for the rest of the week, like the custom is. We'll celebrate and we'll feast together. And at the end of that week, I'll give you Rachel. And then you can have a week worth of party time with her. So you got an 84-year-old virgin who's getting kind of thrown into this thing, right? 2 weeks of celebration in a row. First the one that he didn't want, and then the one that he did. And so he's saying, you fulfill her week, I'll give you her, and then you'll work another 7 years. So a lot of times it's been preached or articulated that he worked 7 years and got Leah, then he worked 7 years and got Rachel. But that's not how it happened. He worked 7 years and got Leah, fulfilled her week, got Rachel, fulfilled her week, and then worked 7 years. Now, if I was Jacob, I might consider leaving after I fulfilled that second week. Because, the original agreement was, I'm working 7 years for Rachel. However, we'll see that he doesn't do that, which says a little bit about his evolving and growing character, because he hasn't always possessed an abundance of it as far as honesty goes. But here we'll see that he does. So he says, fulfill her week. We will give you also for the service which you shall serve me yet another 7 years. And verse 28 says, and Jacob did so and fulfilled her week. I mean, can you imagine what that week would be like? Here's the one I didn't want, the tender-eyed one. I gotta do this. And you know what he's thinking in his mind? I got to do it so that I can get the one that I originally wanted. But still, to have to force yourself to go through that with that, kudos to him for loving Rachel as he did. So he fulfilled her week, and he gave him Rachel his daughter to wife also. And Laban gave to Rachel his daughter Bilhah his handmaid to be her maid. So he does the same thing that he did with Leah. He gives her as a gift a handmaid. In verse 30, which is where we're going to stop for tonight. And he went in also unto Rachel, which means he slept with Rachel. And he loved also Rachel more than Leah, and served with him yet 7 other years. So he stood by his word. He agreed to work 7 more years, and he carried that out. However, in verse 30, it clearly shows that he favors Rachel over Leah, which has created a culture or an environment, much like what we've seen with Abraham, with Sarah and Hagar, that is just going to prove to be problematic, difficult. It's going to create tension in the home. It's going to create rivalry. And we'll see that story unfold as we read along next week. But certainly there's going to be a lot of turmoil in this situation that we see here described in verse 30. But the situation that started out seemingly everything falling into place, everything happening so beautifully and perfectly, has unraveled into something that Jacob undoubtedly did not envision. It's going to cost him more than he realized, and he's going to be staying with Laban longer than he ever thought. But despite the turmoil, despite how everything has ended up, we will see that God continues to work his plan. God continues to use even the difficult circumstances to further his plan. And that plan is what? To bring about a nation. And that nation will come from the loins of Jacob, whose name will be changed to Israel. Israel will be the people of God, the elect of God, to whom this was written and to whom God would use to bring about his plan, ultimately to bring Jesus the Messiah so that he could be the Savior of the world. We're going to stop right there, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to ask any questions at this time.
And do we have any idea how old Rachel was? Was she a lot younger?
We do not know it, or at least I'm not aware of any instances where Rachel or Leah's age is described.
Well, Laban lied from the very start because he knew that when he promised Jacob the first 7 years he'd give him Rachel, but he knew that he wouldn't give her first.
I think you're right. I think it's probable that he knew all along that he would give Leah to Jacob first, or he thought that during that 7-year span someone else would come along that he could marry Leah off to, and that never materialized. Therefore, he sees the opportunity to kind of throw Leah in the tent with Jacob while he's kind of stupid. And, or it could have been a situation where right at the end, right before the 7 years expired, that, he designed this plan. We don't know. The text doesn't say, but given the history of Laban and what we've seen interactively with him and what we'll see futuristically when we read the text, I think it would be probable to side with your assumption that that was his plan. He was a narcissist, and he was going to come out on top. See, narcissists are not just a modern invention.
What do those little signs mean up there? Right above verse 27, those little,
Where at?
The corn and the flower pots.
This here? It's a marker that basically shows you who is doing the speaking. Laban, and then it gives you information about Laban. And then it has this, which is the addressee. So you have the speaker and the addressee, which is the person being spoken to. Yeah. Yeah, that's just this particular Bible is tagged in Logos, which makes it easy to just scroll over it if you're not sure who's doing the talking or the listening in certain verses. Peggy?
Wouldn't there be a possibility that Leah was also had a veil?
She would have been veiled undoubtedly, but I'm pretty sure he didn't have sex with a person who had a veil on their face. I mean, the veil would be taken off after the exchange of vows.
They were dark. They did dark anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it clearly says that evening had come about. You know, hey, baby, I mean, I'm not sure how most people kiss before they have sex. I don't know how he would kiss her before he, you know. Anyway, we could really get, hey, who cares? It's in the Bible, right? We're going to see as we continue when we get into Genesis in the 30s section, we'll see some stories that are quite bizarre and unedited.
He must not have been too ugly if you read on ahead. He had a bunch of kids.
Yeah.
There was another thing here, brother, that says, in 27 says, fulfill her week, and we will give her.
He's speaking on behalf of the family.
Family is life, I guess.
Well, I'm probably the only person that doesn't know what fulfilling her week means.
7 days.
7 days.
Fulfill her week.
Oh,
The phrase fulfill her week
fulfill
is
her week. Okay.
ancient Near East custom where they feasted and celebrated for a week.
Like a honeymoon.
With everybody there.
Yeah.
Verse 12. It must be, did I look at that right? Where it said
Verse 12.
that he was her father's brother? Jacob is his nephew.
Yeah, it's a literal translation. King James, let me highlight it here. King James is a literal translation, and this Hebrew word, ach, can mean brother literally, or it can mean acquaintance or kin. Matter of fact, remember when he met the shepherds? He uses the same word there too. It could be a polite way of saying, bro, hey bro, you know, like we say in our culture. Brother, like Brother Gary, Brother Matt. You're not my little brother, but, you know, it's just a word we use.
Got it.
Any other questions? Bob?
The custom back then was so much different than we can even realize today or think about, as far as giving and receiving, and as far as the way they lived and how many wives they had and what all they did and everything. We can't hardly comprehend that.
Yeah, their cultures and their customs are so foreign to our modern way of life, which is why it's so important to try to place ourselves in their position if we're going to interpret the passages of Scripture correctly, and that's why we always focus that and point it out. Did you have another question?
The third verse, but you couldn't have one without the other. The shepherd without the sheep.
In verse 3,
Yes.
and there were all the, it says flocks, but it should be shepherds gathered, and they rolled the stone from the well's mouth. The fact that it says, and they rolled the stone is what gives weight to it
It'd have to be the shepherd.
being shepherds, yeah. I mean, obviously, the purpose for them rolling the stone away is to water the flocks. So, like you said, you know, you would have both there, but
It could
the
be-
word should be shepherds for sure, as the Samaritan Pentateuch shows and the Septuagint.
Why don't they just put it there?
That's just the decision that the Masoretics made whenever they compiled the Hebrew text that they had available.
They just want to make sure
They're humans. They're humans.
So first, I think it's pretty brilliant what Laban did because clearly he has to know the substance is still there, and Jacob would eventually get the substance of some of that stuff from his mother and father. But secondly, in their culture, and I don't know if this is now or it's just something I've heard, I thought that when a couple gets married, like the first year, they're kind of off together, and I see this as a week, and so,
Cultures change over time, so it evolved into that in more of a actual Hebrew people living in the land of Israel time. This is clearly predates that, so you have a vast array of ancient Near East customs that would be somewhat tweaked or different, varying between different people groups. But this was very common at that time to have a week celebration because it was a highlight of a life. Because I've stated this before, their life existence depended on the ability to procreate. The more you could reproduce and the more kids you could have, the more likely your survival is. And therefore, they seen this as an occasion to feast, to celebrate, to have really a party-like atmosphere where there's joy and celebration and just indulgence in general.
He didn't only get her a week, he got her the rest of her life.
Exactly. Now, I think that he would have been a great worker too, and Laban would have had in mind keeping him there for as long as he could, if not forever, at least in his mind. But clearly, he had instructions to return to the land of Canaan, because that's part of the Abrahamic covenant promise, is the land and descendants. The land and descendants. Matt, did you have something?
did Laban have sons? I'm forgetting about.
Did Laban have sons? I'm not sure if the text bears that out or not.
I just wonder if he didn't, then, I know it's a really bad breakup when they actually do split. And if he was trying to keep them there now that you say that.
We'll get to more of interaction between Jacob and Laban as we continue, because a lot is actually said about Jacob and his stay with Laban and what all evolves and takes place there. So we'll go through that in due time.
Could be on descendant because Rachel was a shepherd.
I'm just trying to picture them, was my comment. They probably look like the Bedouins, sort of like the Bedouins that we would see today.
Yeah, honestly. Yeah. They would have lived similarly, like little makeshift tent-like dwellings, with animal skins, and had flocks that they just went where sustenance was, where there was water and grazing, which is hit and miss in that area.
Say Laban had sons in his story with Rebecca.
It may have. It may have.
What's the question?
He asked, didn't it state that Laban had sons in the story of Laban and Rebecca? I think. It may have. Let me take an opportunity to show you how to do a search. A specific search that expedites. We're going to search all Bible text in, let's reduce that to Genesis. And I'm going to type Laban and, in all capitals, sons. And it would say sons or sons. And it'll show you any verse that has both of those words, Laban and son or sons. So,
31.
there we go.
Okay, there you
We know the answer in advance, though. Did you see how quick the search was, though? It's called expedited research, i.e., cheating, which is nice.
But did
But-
they just stay in one place until the grass and the water run out and then move on?
They would have, a lot of them would have lived a nomadic life, as you stated.
How about the handmaidens that he would give away? Were those most likely, family as well? Or maybe a foreigner picked up?
They would be slave girls that were purchased.
Not to procreate or have families of their own.
In their culture, they used handmaids as, alternate ways of having sex. Different culture. Women they weren't counted in that culture. So, it's hard to grasp how women were treated in that culture, for sure. They were like, to put it bluntly in coon hunters' terms, they were like brood bitches. I know that's pointed, but that's how they viewed women in a lot of the people groups and cultures. They viewed them as something to, produce workers and pleasure. Any other questions?